So good morning, everybody. I do want to talk about the Don Callis family, and in my opinion, the Don Callis family is definitely one of the most underrated factions in all of AEW. And in my opinion, they're actually the greatest faction in all of AEW because, you know, when I think about a good faction, it's people who've won titles, there is some story, and then ultimately, there's drawing power. Like honestly, the Moxley faction or the Death Riders, they're one of the worst factions because obviously, they've not really done anything of note really, but they did help the All In box office really, but the ratings have gone down so much and everything like that really, so they're definitely not one of the top tier factions. But the Don Callis family, in my opinion, are definitely like highly underrated and they're underutilized. And I really want to start this conversation about how can they be pushed, what can change, and do you feel that they have a lot of potential really? And I do want to talk about the ups and downs of the Don Callis family. And the first up that I would say is Don Callis gets a consistent reaction from everybody. Like, people just like boo him, make fun of that he's bald, call him an asshole and whatever really. So honestly, you need people like that. Like he and MVP get the biggest reactions as heels. There's really Yuta in that, but definitely he and MVP get the biggest reaction. The other thing about Don Callis is just like MVP, he knows how to talk really. He's not like Yuta where he's quiet, or he's not like John Moxley where he sounds like a poor man's Bray Wyatt really. Like when Don Callis talks, he knows how to instigate, he knows how to create you know, a moment really when he talks really, and that's very important to all like professional wrestlers, and that's one of the reasons why a lot of wrestlers in AEW suffer, because there's people like Jack Perry who sound like a scared high school freshman when he speaks really, or Matt and Nick Jackson, they sound like high school freshmen, so you can't really take them seriously. But when you have someone like Don Callis, he really sounds like a man. He has to look like a high school principal. He does sound like a man really, like he has a very machismo voice. He sounds very aggravated and frustrated, and that's good, because if you're gonna lead a faction and people are gonna work with you, you have to really just have a sense of the leader having some sense of conviction really. The other thing about Don Callis is that there's a bunch of stories with him, with that he's told really well really. In the Don Callis family, there's Omega leaving the family. There's Omega leaving, and then there's Ospreay leaving. The best story they ever told was Will Ospreay versus Kyle Fletcher, and one of the other stories is like Okada versus, like Okada and Takeshita, because that's going to lead to something really great. And then also like Omega like betraying the Don Callis family really, but no other the other faction was like okay, Hangman versus Moxley. That's a good story. And then also I think another one you did was Jericho and MJF betraying each other. But really, like, out of all those, really, like, the biggest one is Moxley versus Adam Page, because that was over, like, the World Championship. That was at a significant moment. Yes, that's, like, the number one faction storyline in AEW because of really the moment and what was at stake, and really that people were really assuming that, Moxley would have won that. But then the second biggest one is Ospreay versus Kyle Fletcher, because they've never wrestled over a world title. You've never seen Don Callis in the main event of a show. You've never seen the main event of All In, really. If they kind of had that, then that would be honestly number one, really. But when you have somebody like Don Callis lead a group, and then, one of the matches for, if I'm saying it correctly, Revolution 2024 was when you had Sting and Darby versus the Young Bucks, and on that card, one of the highly most talked about matches, it was Takeshita versus Will Ospreay, and then the month later you had Will Ospreay, who's still part of the Don Callis family, Ospreay versus Bryan Danielson, and then later on, and many times you've had Takeshita versus Ospreay, you've done Kyle Fletcher versus Ospreay, and that's roughly about it, and stuff like that. Really, you've done a lot of just like his faction really has like all these really banger matches. So there's definitely a lot of appeal to it. And I also think that I want to talk about some of the weakness of Don Callis family. Like I do think that they have way too many members, and they have like an upper echelon and a lower echelon. And what I mean by that is that the upper echelon is Kyle Fletcher, Will Ospreay, and Konosuke Takeshita. And I'll put Ospreay in that group really because he was part of the family really. But those people rarely lose. And then you also have like on the second tier is Josh Alexander because he's kind of 50-50. You have Lance Archer, who loses a lot. Brian Cage is an excellent example of that because he always loses. And then it's like Hechicero, if I'm saying his name correctly, Rocky Romero, and a few other ones. Like, they have like a bunch of jobbers, really. And that's not good because I think there's supposed to be a group of assassins, if I'm correct. So if you have like 4 or 5 people in your group, they're supposed to be assassins, they lose all the time. That's not good, really. So I think that one problem with having way too many members is that you can't book them too strongly because sometimes you don't want a situation where they're like, okay, there's 10 members, so we're gonna do the NWO thing and have them kind of like take over AEW and take over every division, really. And then also, like I've said, like one big issue with that is that you've done that way too many times in AEW, and a bunch of people just don't. We'll just say, okay, this is just repeat mode, and factions taking over companies. They've done that so many times in professional wrestling. I think a lot of people want to see a break from it. So the fact that they have way too many members is definitely big. And then also, there's nothing at stake, really. If Don Callis says, hey, you know what, Brian Cage, you've been losing too much, so if you lose one more time, you're out of the group, we're going to beat your ass. Or if you have someone like if you have like 3 or 4 members as a trios team, they're like, okay, the next time you lose, you're out, and we're going to beat your ass, really, then you got to do that. But with Don Callis, when you have way too many members, it seems like, he kind of overlooks a lot of just the people who lose, really. So when you have way too many members, not everybody's going to be treated like a celebrity, really, and not every member is going to do a great job. But also, if you're in a faction, you have a lot of people, and you always have that 1 or 2 person that's always losing. Your faction doesn't look that strong, really. Like, when you look at the Death Riders, Moxley always wins, except when he lost to Hangman. And then you also have Yuta, who usually loses. You have Claudio, who's a powerhouse, who usually loses. So sometimes when you have a faction, you have way too many members, you may be like, okay, well, these members, there's some people in the group who's not always going to win, really. We're not always, and the company's not behind, really. So it wouldn't be good to cut the fat on those people. The other issue is that I call the Don Callis family Team Rocket, because, the rule of the Don Callis family is that they always win, except if you're in the lower echelon. Like if you're Brian Cage, Lance Archer, Rocky Romero, Hechicero, and a couple of other people, you usually lose. If your name's Konosuke Takeshita and Kyle Fletcher, you're always going to lose to Will Ospreay. Or you're always going to lose a match if it's for like a big title or something like that. Like, if you're going to do Adam Page versus Kyle Fletcher or Adam Page versus Takeshita, you're going to lose. If you do Okada versus Hangman Adam Page, which I think should happen, you're going to lose. So it always seems like they never ever win the big moment, or it's kind of predictable if you know who they're against. If it's Will Ospreay, I'll bet my entire paycheck, I'll bet all the debt that I owe that on Ospreay because they always lose to Ospreay, and many people have said this before when they did the cage match between Ospreay and Kyle Fletcher should have won that, or it should have been a double count out, really, because it does not hurt Ospreay to lose sometimes, really, but it's not good when you consistently have people lose. So they've also kind of had this thing too where it's so predictable with them, and it's so predictable when they win and lose. Majority of the time, the upper echelon people are going to win, except if they're dealing with a man named Will Ospreay. And that's not good if it's that predictable. The other issue is the Don Callis family fatigue, because I remember there was I think it was last week on Collision, Don Callis was out there 3 or 4 times. Really, he was on the announce table. He did something with Kyle Fletcher. He did something with Hechicero and Rocky Romero. Then he was in the main event. So that's not also good, really, when you have that situation where you see the same person over and over on a show. Really, I think a great example would be a few years ago, over 10 years ago, Triple H came back, when John Cena was a champion. This is the 2000s. And I remember it was almost every single segment he was always popping in, really. I remember one time, there's somebody who played a prank on Vince McMahon. They see Triple H drinking water backstage, really. So it always felt look at me, here I am all the time, really. So sometimes when you have wrestlers that appear a little too much, it becomes a little obnoxious. And it also says, okay, well, it's bad because he's managing all these people, and a lot of the people in this group don't talk that well, So the problem is that he's always going to be, they're going to have an oversaturation of Don Callis, really. So that's one of the big concerns about him in AEW, where I think that yes, it works because he's obnoxious, but the other problem with him is that if you oversaturate an audience, if you have like somebody there 4 or 5 times a show, really, it's like what they said. There's heel heat that draws money, like Hogan in the NWO, and then there's get the fuck off my television heat, which is like, Bully Ray Dudley and the Aces of Eights in TNA wrestling. So you have to kind of pick that, and I think with Don Callis, he can really fall into I'm just gonna click my channel off because I see too much of him. And then the other issue with Don Callis family, this is one of the big issues with AEW, is that they do a lot of cheating. And you can't always have people cheat when they are a villain because it becomes predictable. And then it also says, hey, they can never win matches fairly. And that's not realistic. There are times when, like, there's people like Randy Orton, like, he cheated many times, but there are times when he actually won matches clean, really. You have to have a mix of both, really. But I think with Don Callis' family, they overdo it with him, like, hitting people, and they always do interference with the screwdriver. And then the other thing too is that if he always does this and people like boo and whatever, a referee's gonna notice and be like, hey, you know what, you've done all these things. Really, I've seen like your history. We rewatch matches. And now this is a big opportunity. We're gonna have like you go to the back, and we're gonna have Kyle Fletcher versus Adam Page, and then like maybe the booking will be like, okay, we're gonna give it to Kyle Fletcher for a week or two, just because we want to get into that situation of having people win who are part of that faction. And not always losing, not always like winning by cheating, really. So those are all the things I have to say about Don Callis' family. Like, I think that there's a couple things that I want to do, which is that I really like that Dustin's injured, and I'll talk about this in another video, that they can do like the Von Erichs and Sammy versus the Don Callis family. That's something. Isn't Samoa Joe out because he got injured at All In? Couldn't you have the Don Callis family go after the trios titles? The Don Callis family, you have members like Josh Alexander, Hachishiro, and a few other members. Couldn't they do something like enter tag team tournaments? Could they, since like the Hurt Syndicate, like people, they're villains, but people like them, could you do something where the Don Callis family has matches with them? Like imagine Bobby Lashley versus Josh Alexander. Could you do something like Don Callis says, like, okay, you know what, Kyle Fletcher's a TNT championship, Okada has the international, has like 3 titles now, so can we do something like, could we go after more titles? What about Adam Page? Like Okada's been undefeated for like 500 days with his Continental Championship. Could you do something where he says, okay, at Wrestle Dream, since it is an Antonio Inoki tribute show, it's an NJPW tribute show, could you do something where Okada makes an argument with everybody, says, hey, you know what, I need to actually, where he's like, hey, I need to actually, or I should be a contender because I've never like been defeated or whatever, really, So why aren't they kind of like making other goals? Why aren't they kind of doing something where there's people who are fed up with them and tie stuff in, really? Like, honestly, like, they say Dustin needs surgery. That's why they have the match with Kyle Fletcher. But could you do something where Sammy Guevara and the Von Erich boys, they lose their shit and they attack the Don Callis family to do matches? Could you do something where Don Callis like, I want it all, really? I take a line from Dustin, a loser. I want it all. He was a loser about everything except for that piece of line. Like, can you go after the tag team titles? Can you say something like Okada versus Swerve? You can have something where Okada wins, and then you're like, hey, maybe at All Out or Wrestle Dream, it's Okada versus Hangman Adam Page. That would be a hell of a match, really. Could you do something where you lead to maybe Okada loses that match, Takeshi's acting cocky, and then you see Okada and Takeshita have an issue, and they're fighting each other, and Don Callis is like, hey, you know what, all right, this is getting out of hand, really. So the winner of your match at Full Gear, is going to stay, and the other person's going to be, sent out of the group, really. Then Takeshita loses, he gets beat down, and then Kenny Omega saves his life, really. Could you just do these things, because there's so many stories that you can tell of the Don Callis family. There's so many people that you can utilize. And then it's also sad because you see a person like Josh Alexander. He was a TNA champion for like 300, 400 days, really. And he's kind of walking around like with a big jackass. He looks like a jackass with that headgear. That's not a good use of a guy like that. He's playing background character when he should be like a Will Ospreay type, where he's going out there and getting dirty and whatever, really. So, like I said, it's just like, as they say by AEW, the issue is that they have way too many people, and they don't know how to utilize it. And maybe the other issue is, like they say, that I think the issue is also Tony Khan, because I did talk to Ricky Stark, that one of the issues that if he wants to have all this power, he's not going to listen to other people really. And sometimes, like I said, if you're a chef running a kitchen and you get 100 dishes or 200 dishes, you're gonna forget some dishes really, when everything needs to be right and some things are wrong really. So it's definitely, like I said, it's very, very unfortunate. I do think they're very underutilized. There's so many stories that you can do with them, and I think the conversation needs to start about the Don Callis family. And I think that, as I said, they're definitely the best heel faction in AEW. They've been around for so many years. There's so many stories that they told so well really, but there's so many things that they can do with them right now really. It's like what I said, with AEW, a lot of things are like a C- when they could be an A+ really. And that's why I said, Tony Khan needs to hire me for AEW, because I would definitely think about it, write some stuff down, and have some great ideas really. It's not good with Don Callis. I think that there's a lot of things that they can be doing better with them.